first. Just a couple things before we get started. Please keep your microphones and your cameras off during today's presentation. Also, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box and I will relay them to our presenter after the presentation is over. And lastly, if you could answer the survey at the end of today's presentation, just provide any feedback and or any topics that you would like to see presented on. That would be very helpful for us for planning our spring sessions. So with that, I will turn it over to Scott.
All right, welcome everybody. It's kind of weird. I've done presentations like this before, but never done one without my camera on. So we're gonna make this happen today. Believe me, you guys are gifted by not having to look at me, so that's not really a problem. You're not missing anything. I'm gonna go ahead and the name of the today's presentation is working with people with disabilities, and I'll kind of explain who I am and what my intentions are. But as she said there, if you guys do have questions at the end, I'll gladly answer those. And I appreciate that when you do it, because it allows me to clarify if I perhaps wasn't clear at any point throughout this, or if maybe I just didn't know what I was talking about and you guys want to call me out on that. I'm perfectly fine. So today's presentation is working with people with disabilities. And there we go.
And Scott, if you want to have your camera on, you sure can.
Okay. That's all right. So the goal of today's training is to maybe I will turn it on because it seems weird. The goal of today's training is to reduce fear and increase confidence in working with people with disabilities. So I really tried hard to, as I put this together, to sort of look at throughout my career, what are some of the questions I've been asked frequently, what are some of the misconceptions I've dealt with, and then also, so what are some of the best practices? You're not going to see me talk today a lot about like, here's what the Americans with Disabilities Act says, or here's what Fair Housing Law says, or here's what best practices are for human relations or human resources or things like that. That's not really my intention today, because I wanted to kind of maybe do something a little bit broader and really kind of just look at best practices. So whether you are an employer or a landlord or a person yourself, or maybe a community member, or whatever your role is that kind of brings you here today, or the different social roles that you play in the community, I think that some of what that I will share today will be of value to that, and that's really my hope. And to sort of allow you to implement practical, inclusive practices for a supportive and accessible environment. You're going to also hear from me a lot today, where I'm not going to give you a lot of absolutes. Far too often in today's super divisive world, people live so much around absolutes that it has to be this way or it has to be that way. And the reality is that people are messy and language is messy, and the way that we do this is oftentimes not necessarily black and white. So it's a certain amount of different shades of gray. And so I want to be able to allow you to kind of get some different information so that as you move forward, you can make the best decisions with what you're doing. And I'm going to learn eventually how to flip these slides. There we go. So a little bit about me, and it's always weird to kind of start off something like this, but if I was in your shoes, I'd be like, who's this guy Scott, and what it makes him think he can talk to you about this stuff? So I've served people with disabilities for over 30 years. The longer I do this, the more I realize like how many of the staff I work with and stuff weren't even born when I began to do this. That's not something I feel happy about, but it's just the reality that, you know, I got my first job working with people with disabilities when I was 19 years old, and have kind of stayed in different parts of the career and doing different things, but for the last 30 years. Over 24 years of that time, I've spent providing peer-driven services. So I'm currently the executive director of Independence Incorporated, which is a independent living center located in Minot. We serve the northwestern corner of the state, and there's 4 centers for independent living across the state of North Dakota. All of the state is sort of covered by different quadrants of us. And one of the unique things is that peer-driven part. So over half of our board and staff and management staff are persons with disabilities. So one of the unique aspects of what we do is really that ideal that we are people with disabilities serving people with disabilities. So on top of the fact that I've worked with, you know, hundreds or perhaps even over 1,000 people with disabilities in my career, there's also the fact that we are an organization of people with disabilities. I kind of listed a few different awards that I won. I'm not going to name those off for you today because it feels a little braggadocious, and that's not what I'm intending to do. but I just wanted to let you know kind of what I've done and kind of where I got to how I am today. So let's just really start with what's a disability. And this is something, it's funny, I've been doing a lot of interviewing lately, and it's something about halfway through the interview, I usually stop the person I'm interviewing and I'm like, all right, let's make sure we're on the same page about what a disability is. Because even when people are coming here and applying here, they might not have the real broad range definition of what a disability is. And this is essentially the definition that exists within the Americans with Disabilities Act. Um, and I know I just said we're not going to talk about the laws, but I think that this definition is very appropriate, and it's definitely something that fits. So impairment is a physical or mental condition that limits a person's ability to perform a major life activity. So you know, major life activities can be such things as walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, working, learning, those type of things. So it's any type of condition that significantly limits those type of things. You have to have some sort of record or history of having that, or I'm sorry, this is the next part. So that's the first part of it, the first kind of test of disability. The second is a history of it. Now, the example of a history of it, it may be something like, say, a person with a mental health condition. Like maybe when they're sick, when they're having mental health struggles, they have an obvious disability. But maybe when they're doing well, they don't necessarily. So that doesn't mean that they're not still protected under disability laws and disability protections, or they're not considered a person with a disability. It's not necessarily a switch that you flip on and off, but rather they have that history of being perceived as a person with a disability. And the third part of that is a perceived impairment, which is being regarded as having an impairment by others. This is always kind of an interesting one. For some of the folks that are maybe a little bit older on here that are kind of Gen Zers, or I'm sorry, Gen Xers or older, you might remember like Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the last premier of the Soviet Union. He had, I think it's called a port wine stain, I believe, on his face, on his forehead. So he had a big red mark on his forehead. Now, that is not a disability. That does not affect one or more major life functions. Doesn't actually hurt him in any ways. However, people that have something like that may be perceived by some as having some sort of a disability. So I remember a case law I read a few years ago with somebody that had that a very similar disability that did not affect one or more major life functions, and they were working at a fast food restaurant and were fired because somebody in management felt like it looked like they had some sort of a disease or something like that, and they didn't think they could have people that were diseased, in air quotes, working there. Well, they were protected, or they were considered as being a person with a disability because of that. I'll tell you that third kind of definition of disability is pretty rare. It's not one we actually see very much, but it's just important to keep in mind that you know, if somebody is perceived as having a disability, that they are kind of considered to be disabled under the ADA. So let's talk about some of the fears. And I think that's an important part of when we're doing these disability awareness trainings and disability etiquette trainings, is to really kind of call out what are some of the reasons that people are sort of, can we say, afraid or not sure about how to act around these issues. Number one by far is people are afraid of making a mistake. They're worried about saying or doing the wrong thing. Worried about, you know, unintentionally hurting somebody's feelings or being offensive or being misunderstood. And you know what? That fear can be real because of the fact of what I said earlier, that people are messy and not everybody views things exactly the same. Again, I mentioned to you all earlier that I've been doing this for 30 years. I cannot tell you that if I walk out of here at the end of this training today and I run into somebody in my hallway that has a disability, that I'm not going to say something that might offend them, or I'm not going to do something that's going to offend them. People with disabilities are not all exactly the same. So the key is that, you know, you have to kind of let that fear go and just realize I'm going to do the best that I can. And if I say something that's wrong, or if I say something that people don't like, I'm going to back off and then try something different. The next is fear of the unknown. And I see this so much in like a lot of our younger staff that we have, just not necessarily understanding how to react around certain things. And examples I'll oftentimes use is, say somebody that has a physical disability, somebody say with quadriplegia, and you meet with them and you go to shake their hand, and all of a sudden they lift up their hand, and you know, their hand doesn't open up the same way that my hand opens up. And so suddenly that person doesn't know quite how to understand that or how to respond to that. And it just kind of becomes a little bit uncomfortable. And I used to have a boss of mine who was a person with quadriplegia, and he'd be like, just grab onto that and give it a grip. You know, he's like, you don't have to shake my hand exactly the same to go through the motion, or maybe give a fist bump or something. The next is fear of inadequacy. Uh, and this can especially come into contact or as a point with some of us who have been in the professional field for a while. Really kind of just feeling unprepared or feeling like you don't lack the skills necessary to understand all aspects of people with disabilities. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. I've been doing this for 30 years. I do not understand all aspects of how to work with people with disabilities. I have a pretty good understanding. I definitely have a lot of experience, but that doesn't mean, again, the next person I come across isn't going to have some different way of doing things. Um, and so it's okay to kind of feel unprepared. So you lean into this. Fear of negative perception, fear about being judged by your peers or the public about how they interact with people with disabilities. And I'm not going to tell you that people with disabilities don't sometimes lean into this or sometimes, in fact, do judge people if they react wrongly. Amongst my kind of network of friends of people with obvious physical disabilities, there's kind of an ongoing joke of like, stupid things that people say to people with disabilities, because the reality is that sometimes people do come across as a little bit silly, and there's a certain amount of vulnerability that comes with that you might say something, but there's also the point of, you know, of just being okay. So for example, if I see somebody that uses a wheelchair and I say, hey, walk over here, I don't need to like freak out and be like, oh my God, this person can't walk, I just offended them. Or hey, I haven't seen you in a while, to somebody who's blind. It's okay to still use kind of the same common languages that you would use. And if they make a joke about that, that's okay. You can laugh about it. It is kind of funny. And humor is an okay way to kind of break through some of the tension that happens from time to time. So you don't have to worry quite so much about that kind of negative connotation. And again, I think the people that most remember it kind of being treated differently because of fear and negative perception, it's usually people that do it pretty egregiously. I'll give you a real life example. A few years ago, we had an intern. This is when I worked in another community, but we had an intern that went across the street for a meeting, and he was waiting to come back across the street. He happened to be somebody that used a wheelchair, and he was a high level or low level paraplegic, so he had strong upper body strength, and he was waiting to cross the road, and all of a sudden, somebody like screeched on their brakes and stopped, and they hopped out of the car and they ran over and they grabbed onto his wheelchair and they pushed him across the road. Now that is the exact equivalent of like stopping your car, running over, picking up somebody waiting to cross the road and lifting them over and then setting them back down again. This guy was completely freaked out. So that's the kind of negative stuff that we talk about when we talk about stupid things that people do to people with disabilities. We're not talking about you maybe say something a little bit wrong or maybe misunderstand something. That's going to happen, and most people are going to be okay with that. Fear of dependency is that people worry about supporting individuals with disabilities that may lead to them becoming overly reliant on assistance. It's a legitimate thing to talk about that and to worry that. I work at a place called Independence Incorporated, a resource center for independent living. I'm a big fan of independent living, if you can't tell. Not a big fan of dependency. I'm not a big fan of people not taking charge of their lives. But that being said, there's a certain right way and a wrong way to really teach independence. And shame is a pretty bad motivator. And so being like, if I do this for you, you're become dependent on me is not quite as much as, hey, how can I help you to do a little bit more yourself? Or, what is the barrier that you're facing that you can't do this yourself? Like setting the expectation of independence and allowing people to kind of find their own path to that, as opposed to, I'm not going to help you out because you're just going to become dependent on me. Next, fear of change. Look, I just turned 50. I've been making a lot of jokes about that lately, about what this means. Like I watched Matlock shortly after I turned 50. It was a new Matlock that's on CBS right now, but I just felt like watching the show like Matlock meant that I'm 50. I'm waiting to get my AARP card in the mail. I'm super stoked about this stage of my life, but it also means that things have changed a lot. I don't really want things to change too much more. I get that. I understand that. And the reality is when we talk about throughout this conversation today, and as we talk about working with people with disabilities, there's certainly going to be aspects of that conversation that's going to change. It's just not exactly the same as it's always been. That's okay. just kind of understanding that the way we talk changes, the way people react to stuff changes, the attitudes and values of our community changes, and being able to kind of react to that. Fear of conflict comes up quite a bit. Anxiety about potential disagreements or challenges in meeting the needs of individuals with disabilities. Not every person with a disability necessarily is always going to be the nicest human you've ever met. Some people are cranky. Some people are, I mean, people with disabilities are just like everybody else in society in this way, that you'll find some really nice folks and some folks that aren't maybe quite so nice, and everything in between. And you're going to have some people you're going to conflict with a little bit. But the key is again, communication. We're going to talk about that as we go throughout this. The final one, and this comes into play far more often than I care for it to, which is a feel of liability. It's that worry about lawsuits, legal repercussions about related to accommodations or accessibility, to the point where people don't actually do anything. And a story I often tell when I talk about this was, there was a business in town here that I went to meet with. And the reason I went to meet with this business, this is a small business. This is like, think mom and pop shop. Mom and, the owners live upstairs from the building. They do not make a lot of money. And the building has 2 levels. And so one of the reasons I went there was I was talking with a friend of mine who uses a wheelchair, who said that business does an amazing job of accommodating me. They don't allow me to go downstairs. However, they're really good about bringing the services up to me, and I feel I can participate in all aspects of that store because they make accommodation. And so I wanted to go meet with this business and talk to them. And she was so scared to meet with me, to the point where her husband had told her, do not meet with him, because I've heard about in other states how people that are disability rights advocates are coming in and filing lawsuits and shutting businesses down. I wasn't there to shut them down. I was there to compliment them on the services that they were offering and the way that they were accommodating people with disabilities. I understand that putting in a $200,000 elevator into this mom and pop shop making $35,000 a year wasn't going to be very likely, and that it would absolutely shut them down. But I'm like, you guys have found a different way to provide services, and I wanted to celebrate that. And since that time, we joke about that quite a bit, because we built a relationship out of that. And so, whereas yes, legal realities do come into play, much more good advocacy has been done through good conversations, and much more impactful advocacy has been done through good conversations than it's ever been done through lawsuits or by shutting down and refusing to make modifications because you're worried about the legal ramifications of it. I often tell people, there are not very many ADA experts or accommodation experts out there who are attorneys. And even some of the bad advice that attorneys will give sometimes on this issue are rather significant. So I think it's extraordinarily important to not allow that fear of liability or that feel of lawsuits to kind of stop you from working on accommodations and modifications. So let's talk a little bit about language. And I just talked about not being afraid of change. All natural languages change, and language changes affect all areas of our use. The types of language and change include the sounds, lexicon changes. I always struggle with that word, but changes in syntactic. Oh my gosh, you guys, you can read that. Basically all aspects of it. I apparently am not going to ever be a linguistic because I can't even pronounce half these words. However, I am fascinated by the whole idea of linguistic history. One of the best books I ever listened to, it's not one you're really going to read because you're going to struggle with it, but it's called This English Language, which just goes through the history of the English language. And yeah, I totally nerded out on this book, but it also tells you how much our language changes naturally over time. And it's to the point where things change rather significantly. And there's an example I like to use on this. So the word unicorn, unicorn that we all know is a mythical animal, typically represented by a horse with a single straight horn projected from its forehead. Little known fact, perhaps, is that the unicorn is actually the national animal of Scotland. And you always kind of wonder, like, well, where did that all come about and why? And most likely it was because of the mythical use of this animal and everything else. But there's also a little bit more interestingness about the word unicorn. The Old English word cornu, maybe is how you pronounce it, was literally meant one horn. And so what they would call a unicorn, or that Unis corneo, or whatever it is there, cornel, actually wasn't just this mythical creature when it originally came about to England in Old English. It actually meant something very different. So what they called a unicorn is what we would call a rhinoceros, because that was a single horn, or one big horn, creature. So when they were originally in Old English and in Scotland talking about unicorns, they weren't thinking about it as the mythical creature that we think of today. They were thinking of a rhinoceros, right? Wow, good thing I'm getting paid to talk today, you guys. But they were thinking of a rhino. So it's just a very different, not only ideal, but a completely different creature, that it wasn't always a mythical creature, but language changes over time. So within that, there are some historical terms that have been referred to for people with disabilities that we would not really use today. Words like cripple, for example. Now, cripple is a word that's used from time to time in our language, but not often to refer to people. Same with idiot, fools, lunatic. Those are all examples of words that were not just used like in a negative, or sort of a unofficial, or kind of a slang term to refer to people. Those were at one point actually scientific words used to describe people with disabilities. And if you're in North Dakota, Measure 1 this time actually has removing some of that language from the North Dakota State Constitution, because we actually have some of the language and the remnants of this in our within our law and within our state constitution to this day. So those, again, at one point, those were considered to be perfectly acceptable terms. They weren't terms that were necessarily used in sort of the derogatory way that it's used today. It was the scientific term, but over time, as it began to be used derogatorily, it obviously became less appropriate for it to be used in a scientific or a professional or in a civilized world, if you will. So those words were taken out of that, and other words were brought in that were better words. And that process sort of repeats itself throughout time. This idea that the language that we use to refer to people with disabilities does in fact evolve. So let's look at a couple of examples. And one of the biggest that I oftentimes get asked to bring up is the issue of the word handicapped. Now, I will tell you, and it's important to like change and understand when you do things wrong. And when I did this presentation for about 10 years of my career, I talked about how it was because in Old England, if you were a person with a disability, you could get a permit to beg, and you literally held your cap out, and that became your permit to beg. And I told that story for years, and it's a complete fallacy. It never happened. That isn't actually where the word came from. So if you hear that story, it's important to kind of evolve, because we know now that that is not how the linguistic history of the word handicapped comes from. The word handicapped actually comes more out of closer along with, if you're a golfer or a bowler, the way the handicap is used in that term, which was, it started as a parlor game, and it was sort of a term for equalizing contests to make them fair, so that different players of different skill sets could play it on a more equal basis. And so from that, the word handicap basically began to be put at a disadvantage. And then eventually, as some of those other words we just talked about, the lunatics and cripples and stuff like that, became out of favor, the word handicap came in to sort of replace that. And it's a relatively historically new term. It was probably in the mid 1940s, 1950s that the term really popularized, but it does carry a negative connotation, and a lot of folks really don't like the term. It's oftentimes listed as amongst the top 10 words that people with disabilities like the least, up there with some words that I'm not actually going to repeat, but you can see on my screen. So we don't, within the professional world, use that word. And so often it's like, well, what do you call the parking spots? Well, we call the parking spots accessible, because accessible means that's what it is. It's a spot that is used that makes it accessible for people that use wheelchairs or people that have mobility impairments. It doesn't mean to be put at a disadvantage. So if you say handicapped parking, it means a disadvantaged parking spot. Well, the parking spot's not disadvantaged, it's accessible. And so we are more likely to use the word accessible in lieu of that as a better word. Now, I'm not going to get any further here before I talk about the fact that there is individual choice. People can call themselves anything they want to call themselves. everybody has that right, and people can kind of have that right to say, like, you know what, I don't like anything that Scott said today. I prefer to be called a cripple. That's just what I am. And you know what? If that's what word you choose, you have that right. But there's a difference between what people choose to call themselves and what those of us who are in a professional world choose to use. And that in a professional world, we just have a little bit of an obligation to use a little bit more inclusive language. And so that's a lot about what I'm going to be talking about today. So first off, I'm going to talk about people first language and talking about how language changes over the 30 years that I've been doing this. People first language, even though it goes back to 50 years ago, so about the time that I was born, it didn't really hit Minnesota, North Dakota, the areas that I was working in, until like the early 90s, when it really started to kind of focus on that people first language. It began kind of simultaneously in two different parts of the world, and there's great feuds about, was it an American thing or was it a Swedish thing? But they were both out of that sort of disability self-advocacy movement, so folks with intellectual disabilities. I'm an American, so I believe Americans created everything. So I go along with it. First came out of Salem, Oregon, about January 8th, 1974. And you can see the quote there where the person says, "I'm tired of being called the R word. We are people first." And so that is a lot of where that kind of came from, this idea that stop defining me by my disability, stop with all of this other stuff, and remember that I'm a human. And obviously, if you look at the historical reality that people with disabilities were oftentimes dehumanized, it's easy to understand where that comes from. That people with disabilities weren't seen as equal. They weren't seen as and not only were they not seen that way, but they were treated as second-class citizens. They were victimized by society. The history is very dark, and also very untold. So I understand where that came from. And so when we were talking about people first language, which is primarily what you will hear me use, it's definitely the language that's most preferred within the professional community today. You'll hear things around the lines of like person who uses a wheelchair, person with an intellectual disability or developmental disability, person who has been diagnosed with cancer or something like that, person without a disability. So we won't say things like non-disabled, or we won't say things like quote unquote normal. We'll just say person without a disability, person with a learning disability, person with a physical disability. It really kind of starts off with that person first language. And again, person first language is probably the most dominant in the professional world. However, as I like to say, languages change. And in the last 5 years or so, I began to see more of a emergence of identity first language. And identity first language is very much being pushed in the kind of TikTok world and the very young. And I'm going to try hard right now to switch my identifying words here from the autistic community. There's certain amounts of autistic self-advocates who very, very strongly prefer identity first language. And the term identity first language refers to wording about a person that leads to a description about them in the context of their disability. People prefer such terms because they consider characteristics being referred to as an inseparable part of their identity, hence the word identity within the term. And so you see in the bottom a quote that it said, autism is a part of who I am. Stop trying to get me to hate myself. You don't need to remove autism to make me into a full person. So from that identity first comes this whole, you would never say, for example, I'm a white male. You would never say I'm a male with whiteness. And so they're like, well, I mean, part of who I am is I'm white, and part of who I am is I'm autistic or I'm disabled. So it really kind of starts off with that identity first language. And that being said, some aspects of the greater disability community really never bought into people first language. And the first two you see there, which is the deaf and blind communities, they tend to look at deafness and blindness as more of a cultural issue than even as a disability. So they never really completely leaned into the whole, like a person with deafness or a person with blindness. They continue to use deaf and blind. And you can see here, deaf person, blind person, autistic person, disabled person, and intellectually disabled person. It's really that aspect of identity first that says, I'm not going to lean away from that. I'm going to lean into the fact that a disability is who I am. And I will tell you this, that as somebody that's worked in this field for a really long time, people being proud and being able to accept what their disability is a very important indicator of life success. that when you stop spending efforts on trying to hide who you are, trying to pretend that your disability doesn't actually affect one or more of your major life functions, you end up losing so much energy. And so what I like about Identity First is that the folks that are really leaning into this are being like, it's who I am. It's just part of who I am. I'm not going to apologize to anybody. It's what I am. So I appreciate that, and I think it's a natural evolution. And I'll be curious to see. Now, that being said, part of the reason I continue to use it in a personal or in a professional world almost exclusively is we also want people to be able to understand the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is People First, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is People First. So it's so codified in our laws right now that I don't want people to completely lose the aspect of People First language and the importance of it, but I will also give space for people that don't choose to use that. I actually just hired somebody who told me he was a person with autism, and he's a young man. And in the process of talking to him, I asked him what he preferred. And what he said to me was, you know what, around my friends, I use Identity First, but around in a professional world, I use People First. And that's okay. So again, we're not looking for perfection here. We're looking for consistency, and we're looking for a certain amount of understanding. So who prefers Identity First language? I mentioned earlier deafness, blindness. At the bottom here, you see the red instead autism advocacy groups. Those are advocacy groups. So within the autistic community, or there's kind of a division at times between the blue and red, and there's like this at times civil war that erupts in that world. And there's also, if you look above that, the National Federation for the Blind and another organization for the blind that I'm blanking on right now. But they so there's disagreements even within the communities, and that's okay. But there's just definitely a difference. So People First language always preferred. Most kind of intellectual disability, developmental disability, self-advocacy groups still pretty much promote People First language. Autism Speaks advocacy groups. People First, as I said earlier, is established in state and federal law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and all those different laws. Another one that's even probably newer to People First language than most of the kind of disability community is the recovery community. The recovery community uses things like, rather than say an addict or druggie or junkie or things like that, they've really been embracing the People First language. So saying things like people in recovery, person with substance abuse disorder, person in active use, person in recovery or long-term recovery. So that community has been really embracing the People First and really kind of teaching that as well. So I think it's important to kind of look at that as you're kind of angling on this, is that there are differences in when to do this. Dwarfism and short stature is an interesting one because they go both ways all the time on this. Organizations centered around people with dwarfism often use both People First and Identity First. So People First examples are person who has dwarfism, people of short stature, and Identity First is dwarf or little person. So it very much, in that case, they use, the community uses them both ways. So let's look a little bit about some of the keys to working for people with disabilities. First off, one of the main reasons, first, you all are here today. You guys are part of the solution. Just coming and listening to what I'm saying and paying attention to this and thinking like this, that's the first step. And you know, if we had a few thousand more people that could do this, we could make so much progress in the world of equity for folks with disabilities. But effectively working with people with disabilities fosters inclusivity, equality, and diverse contributions to communities, and enhances quality of life. And that's actually the part that I talk about when I talk often about why I do what I do. You're not going to hear a whole lot of like, well, I do it because I have this big heart and I just want to care about people and I just want to help people. It's not to say that I don't have those things, but I actually more often talk about we need to unlock the potential of people. We have people that, because of their disability, that aren't participating in our society in the way that they should be, whether it be by working or participating in the community or voting or whatever it is. And I think that we're a weaker society because we don't have all of this stuff. So a lot of what I kind of, my focus of what I do is about increasing participation, and in order to kind of make our community stronger. It also saves time and money. And that is a big thing because I did talk earlier about how, um, look, we're not looking for lawsuits. We're not looking for anything like that. But what we want is that if we can just save a little bit of time by doing things efficiently and effectively the first time, it's so much more efficient. And a little bit of time invested today can save some time and money in the future. So let's talk a little bit about reasonable accommodation. Um, I kind of broke it out today, two different ways. And again, these aren't necessarily like just like based on laws, but just more kind of general accommodations and modifications. But a reasonable accommodation is a modification or adjustment enabling an individual with a disability to perform job duties or access services effectively. One of the things it says on the bottom here is that most reasonable accommodations are low cost or even free. Anyone that you pay for is oftentimes less than $500, but a majority of them cost nothing. So we look through this list here. Things like flexible work schedules most likely cost nothing. Modified workstations, there might be a little bit of an expense there, but not always, and sometimes it's very minor. My old boss, his modified workstation was he had a couple of 2x4s underneath his desk, and it lifted it up so that he could sit a little bit higher. Now, you can go into offices today. In fact, right outside my door, we have workstations that that are mobile that you can stand up or sit down in. The screens adjust differently. Like as we've kind of begun to understand the importance of having healthy workstations, a lot of things that used to be called modifications have just become a little bit normal as part of society. But those kind of things can be a deal. Assistive technology is another example of where what we were talking about 20 years ago with assistive technology is oftentimes better kind of off the shelf today. So for example, if I was going to 20 years ago, if I was going to have like a dictation system, I'd go buy an expensive system that I'd hook up into my CD-ROM at that time and upload this program on my computer, and it would listen to my words, but it would be really inaccurate, and it would in all likelihood not be much faster than just me typing it out. Today, as we're talking, I saw somebody started the transcript of this. So just by pushing a button, a transcript will exist of this. That was an assistive technology modification a few years ago that's now available off the shelf. And what's available off the shelf is significantly better than anything that we were buying 20 years ago. So within an iPhone or within your cell phone, there are dozens of assistive technology modifications that exist on there that are oftentimes free or sort of built into the system. Remote work options, another thing. You go back pre-COVID, that was oftentimes the most common request for a reasonable accommodation was remote work, and nobody could do it. Nobody wanted to do it. It wasn't possible. And then we all learned how to do it during the ugly days of COVID-19. As I sit here today, my entire workstation, essentially, if I had to, I could pack it up and go work at home for 2 weeks. That wasn't the place. Please don't make me do that. I do like humans. I actually don't prefer to work at home, but if I had to, I could without missing a beat. Again, that's one of those aspects of where just remote work is possible in a way that it wasn't before. Accessible communication. Again, this presentation today is being closed captioned. I saw somebody turn that on, and it's a fantastic thing that's just available. Nobody has to come on and type it in. Not that long ago, when I would be involved with some of my national boards that I was on and stuff like that, we would bring in somebody to do cart services. So we bring in somebody for the folks that were deaf or hard of hearing. We bring in somebody to type everything we are saying. And eventually, the person who was using this said the built-in technology as part of Zoom is actually more efficient than that person sitting there typing, and it's a heck of a lot cheaper. So let's just keep going with that. And that was her choice. She in her case, but and other times it might be a sign language interpreter. It might be something like that. Modified job duties, extended work leave for medical reasons, reserve parking. Reserve parking is always one I like to talk about. Every building in North Dakota, if you have parking, you should have at least one parking spot that's accessible. And if they have that parking spot, it should also be van accessible and have the proper signage. If you reach out to me, I'll gladly share you all that information. I will tell you that most places don't actually follow that. But that being said, just having a reserved parking spot in front of your building for your customers doesn't negate the fact that you might need to have an extra one if you have an employee with a disability. Because, I mean, and just think about that. So in front of my building, I have 3 spots that are accessible spots. If I had only one, let's say, which is all I'm actually required to based on the size of my parking lot, but that spot is always filled by a person with a disability, it kind of negates the advantage of having an accessible spot for visitors to our building, our customers, or something like that. If you have a housing type arrangement, you may need to, and you have kind of a public parking spot that is for accessible parking, you may need to create another spot for somebody with a disability who lives there in order to not always use up your reserved parking spot for that person with a disability. I just think that that's one of those important things. Those are some of the common reasonable accommodations. Next, we have modifications to policies and practices. Now, these are more macro level things that we can do within our jobs to just make society kind of run smoother and things like that. So implementing modifications to policies and practices enhances accessibility and inclusivity for individuals with disabilities, benefiting everybody by fostering a more supportive environment. And the advantage I always think of when I think about modifications that happen just to a building is power doors. If you have power doors on your building, I 100% guarantee you that at some point, somebody that doesn't have a disability has used those. That's just a great example. Another one that comes into play sometimes is like wider restrooms. A friend of mine always jokes about how people with disabilities get the Taj Mahal of restrooms. The reality is that all of us would probably prefer to have a little bit bigger restroom stalls. Another friend of mine he always jokes he's going to make up T-shirts. He's a person who uses a wheelchair, but he's going to ban the small stalls because he said nobody wants to go in the small stalls. Everybody wants to go in the big one. So when he has to go in the big one, he gets frustrated because nobody wants a small one. So he says, just get rid of all the small ones and make them all bigger. So some examples of modifications include inclusive language. Require the use of plain language in all written and verbal communications to ensure clarity for everyone. I am a big fan of kind of AI. If you don't know how to kind of make things down to a certain level, go to something like ChatGPT, put your paragraph in there and say, rewrite this at a 4th grade reading level or at an 8th grade reading level. Allowing things to be done in a little bit more easier way, in a little more readable way is extraordinarily important. And I'm going to pick on the lawyers here again, because oftentimes lawyers love to kind of legal write up stuff and make things super complicated. So when you're looking at like rules for your buildings, perhaps, or leases or contracts or things like that, it's just so important in order to be inclusive to make sure that the person that's doing that actually can read that. And even if you look at a newspaper, I believe is written at like a 6th grade level. So if your legal documents that you're having people sign are written at a college or a master's level or law level, why are we expecting people to understand that? And are we putting people into a situation where they can't be expected to understand that? Accessibility standards. Establish accessibility standards in all your facilities. Now, am I going to tell you that tomorrow we can make every one of the buildings that are out there accessible? Of course not. But we are 34 years post Americans with Disabilities Act. If we don't begin to actually make plans to make things more accessible now, when is that ever going to happen? I don't know what it's going to take. And some of these things might be so expensive, are so unreachable that we can't even plan for it, or we don't even have a way to do it, but that doesn't mean we can't plan for it. And when we actually have plans in place to make things accessible, it happens quicker. So all of a sudden you're fixing a sidewalk that hasn't been fixed in 20 years. You know what? Maybe we put in a better ramp there. Or you're fixing your doors and you're like, maybe we need to make sure that they're wide enough. So really just kind of have a plan for how you're going to make your physical space a little more accessible. Next is implementing modifications next is training programs. Training on disability awareness and inclusion for all staff. Make it as part of your annual training. Really kind of emphasize the fact that, we're going to talk about this. Maybe have some aspect of what I talked about today. Maybe have some aspect about, like, a big one is if somebody comes in and requests an accommodation, what do you do? The worst thing you want to do is just tell people you don't have to accommodate people. That's just not factually true. Of course you have to accommodate people. Now, does it have to cause an undue hardship or excessive burden for your company? Of course not. but you need to be able to respond to that in a way that it's the right person making that decision, not just, you know, somebody that's untrained. Um, Also kind of creating supportive workplace policies that promote reasonable accommodations and ensure that employees feel comfortable in requesting them. So the first aspect too is that within your normal human relations policy, human resources policies, um, have how do you request an accommodation? And look at this as we are all struggling with workforce issues right now. If you could provide a reasonable accommodation for one of your employees to keep them on the job, to get them more effective or more efficient, and to not leave, that's a benefit for all of us. So really kind of ask that within our policies at work, when a new employee comes on board, they are given a reasonable accommodation sheet. Do you want to request an accommodation? They're also given that on during their annual review. Do you want to make an accommodation? Or they have the opportunity to do that at any other time. Now, am I going to tell you that every accommodation request I've ever had, I've approved? No. Why? Because people are smart Alex, and somebody tried to request a nap rug for their office so they can sleep in the afternoon. It was not a disability related accommodation. They were just lazy and I did not approve it. But that being said, I was appreciative of the fact that they, you know, they used the form. The next thing is kind of training programs, implement training programs on disability awareness. Whoops, I think this is a redo. Sorry. Let's go next page. So as we get to the end here, I kind of love this Mark Twain quote, which it says the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and lightning bug. And so as we talk about all of this, don't worry so much about using the wrong word, but just try your best to use the right word. And if you're told that you're wrong, be okay with that. Be accepting of that and be like, how can I make better your language, or how can I listen to this person and kind of make modifications. With that, we are at the end, and I actually took up a good hunk of the time. So I guess if there's any questions at this time, I'd gladly answer it.
Are there any questions for Scott?
Also, I have no idea why this little red thing ended up over here.
Yeah.
I have no idea where that came from, but it ended up on every slide at the end.
Not seeing any or hearing any. If anybody wants to just come off their mute, you can definitely just ask your question too, whatever's easiest.
I guess I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Joe. I go to Mono State University. I guess it's more of how do we slow things down for people with disabilities when we're in such a fast-paced corporation type of thing?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. How do we slow things down? I think I'll say it this way: is far too often we become a little bit too in love with the way we're doing things and assume that we don't have to make modifications or changes to it. There's going to be times where you have to pause things. You have to do things at the pace of the people you're serving, your customer base, whatever it is. If I can kind of give you a real life example of one I've been fighting a little bit lately, and I talked earlier about how you know, everybody got used to working at home. Everybody fell in love with remote work. And there are so many advantages to that. And in fact, one of the largest remote work employers right now is the state of North Dakota. And so a large number of employees for the state of North Dakota now work remotely. At one point now, the flip side, the problem with that is that some of the people that need to come in contact with people with disabilities, it's created some barriers there. So real life examples, it used to be that if I was filling out, and I don't want to pick on particular programs here, so I'm just going to say government form X. I'm filling out government form X. It used to be you went down to the government building in town, and I walked in there, and somebody helped me fill out that form. And it was a paper copy, because I'm a person with a disability who doesn't have internet access. I don't have a cell phone. I don't know how to use computers. I just need somebody to help me fill this out. So pre-COVID, somebody went down there and filled that out. Nowadays, they want everything to be done using a portal through the state website. But in order to have a portal for the state website, you have to have an email address. You have to have, well, first off, you have to have some sort of a computer or a phone or something that you can do it on. Secondly, you have to have an email address. But on top of that, once you get through the portal process for the state, you have to have two-factor authentication. And so you have to have a cell phone that you can text a number to. But what about the people that don't have computers, the people that don't know how to use computers, and the people that don't have emails, and the people that don't have cell phones? So in order for that process to work, the state has to slow down their system. They have to find other ways to do it. I will tell you, the state has not yet 100% figured out what that means. Part of my job as an advocate is telling the story right now, because your policies are not more important than accommodating people in these situations, and especially accommodating the people that you're supposed to be helping through government program X. So I think, that's one of the most important aspects of this, is to just realize that we have to actually slow down sometimes. We actually have to take that time and, and just understand that and sort of build that into our expectations. I hope that answers your question.
It did.
Thank you. Any other questions?
There was just one comment in the chat. I don't have any questions, but great presentation and thank you for your time. There's
absolutely.
Is there any books, podcasts, videos for reference on the section you talked about for language barriers?
Oh, that is a fantastic question that I don't have an answer for off the top of my head. There's a lot on People First, Identity First. TikTok is where a lot of Identity First language comes on. And again, if there's anybody on there that's a state employee, I apologize because you guys can't access TikTok. Well, I mean, I'm sure it's on Instagram and stuff like that. There's some good stuff around Identity First and the need for it. Sorry, I don't have a great answer for you on that. I wish I did. Any other questions?
I don't see any. So I think with that, we will wrap it up. If anyone does have questions, please reach out and we can get them forwarded to Scott. And so with that, thank you guys all for attending today's session. Next week, we have our presentation of second chances can be the best chances for success. And that is presented by Paulette Paulson with the LCD group. So hope you all can join us next week. Again, be on the lookout for the survey that will be sent out. Please provide any feedback or topics you would like presented on. And also, if you need a certificate of completion, please email Stacy and she will get that out to you. So with that, I think we will wrap it up and hope everybody has a good rest of the day.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
Scott.
You bet.